we've been humbled by the reception that our report has received today from the Regional Council, and we trust that it meets the communities of Hawke's Bay's expectations of us. And as we have said throughout the proceedings today, we're immeasurably grateful for the contributions that the Hawke's Bay communities, including in particular mana whenua, have made to this process, and we're happy to answer any questions.
What struck out to you the most in this whole process in terms of a key finding or a failing that happened here?
Well, we've made 47 recommendations, and I think it's very difficult for us to try and highlight individual aspects, and I'm really loath to try and do that. We've been touched by multiple stories, multiple situations, and we've tried to reflect all of those in the decisions, and sorry, not the decisions, the recommendations that we've made. And we just commend it to the Regional Council to consider what we've said, and hopefully it will lead to a new way forward.
Are you confident that they will take these recommendations on board and act on them?
Well, that's not for us to say. With the reception the report has received so far seems very positive. We're gratified by that, but ultimately our job is now done. We've presented our report, and it's now with the council for them to determine what to do next.
And some of these findings and recommendations are based around historic flood data and the fact that some properties were built perhaps where they shouldn't have been. In your report and in your recommendations, do you envisage that some of these communities might have to move in future, or just that future planning recommendations would be changed? I
think our first and foremost point would be that there needs to be conversations with those communities about what the future looks like for them. It's not for us to make any conclusions about that.
This could be for any of you, but perhaps you, Kyle. One of the councillors, Jeff, I thought made quite a good summing up point. He said raising the stop banks is just not the solution. Going off some of your recommendations, is that a fair takeaway? I know there's a lot in there, but that's a fair takeaway, isn't it, Kyle?
That is a fair takeaway, and I think raising stop banks is far too simplistic. It's about creating a system where you know where water's going to go when the capacity of those stop banks are exceeded. So having an idea of having spillways, diversion channels, and trying to keep the water as shallow as possible. By building stop banks higher and closer together, the water becomes deeper and faster and more dangerous for when the stop banks do inevitably breach. So yeah, certainly stop banks will be part of the solution, but it's stop banks in a different form with differential levels of service, spillways and diversion channels to safely get floodwaters from the mountains to the sea.
With the spillways and the diversions, I suppose that raises a couple of questions for the council, and maybe that's for them, not for you to recommend, but two things that jump to mind would be, do you recommend council buy land with nobody on it for those spillways or diversions, or do you recommend that council use areas where there's low populations for those diversions or spillways?
Well, that would be something for the council to consider, and the spillways and diversions are not things that are always underwater. They're only needed for very large events. So there's examples around the country where there are spillways that are still used for cropping or other uses, secondary uses, when they're not used for flooding. So it's about having sensible land uses on those areas so they can function as floodways and spillways when needed, but it's not putting lives at risk when they do flood. So it could be evacuations or land use types that are more resilient to flooding.
Where it's used in other parts, because I think it even talked about it being sort of a global thing now, where a lot of people are doing it overseas as well. Where it is used overseas, spillways, diversions, as well as stop banks, is it usually councils or local authorities that own that land, or just in other scenarios, or is it a bit of a mix? I'm basically trying to get to is if council are looking at having to spend a lot of money to buy land or not. In other areas, do they generally, local authorities own the land, or is it a bit of a mix?
Well, from my knowledge, it is a mix, and there's examples closer to home, like in Canterbury, there's a large secondary stop bank that protects Christchurch up to a 1,000-year flood. So the land in between that stop bank and the Waimakariri River isn't solely owned by council. There's numerous private land owners in that area. But yeah, that's one particular example close to home. of a secondary system.
In some of these areas where they do have stop banks and some where they don't, you also focused a bit on there and trigger levels. And was it a surprise that the council didn't have those in place? They didn't know at what point to evacuate people?
I think that, just to be clear, that the regional council's responsibility is to provide advice to civil defence on those matters. And yeah, from what we could see and what we were provided, the level of planning and preparation for giving that advice was lacking. And in some cases it didn't account for previous large flood events, like in 1938 flood in Esk in particular. So it was, yes, and some of the language used in the advice led to some, there was some uncertain language that was not helpful in that situation.
Because some residents say that, some areas like Esk would be safe if there was a trigger level and there was an alert level, so people were taken out of the area early. Was that a finding?
I think safe is a challenging word to use in Esk when the level of hazard is up to the roof. And the ability to accurately forecast and predict river flows is not easy. I think there was certainly information circulated by the regional council in the days prior to the flood that highlighted some of the risks. But yeah, for evacuations to be for evacuation to be effective, the level of risk has to be lower. It's still a threshold for considering where is it safe to occupy, even with an effective evacuation system.
Your report also highlighted the inequities for flood protection for Māori communities in mana whenua. What's your recommendation to the council?
O tuatahi ake ka mihi ki ngā marae, ngā whānau, ngā hapu, me ngā iwi o tēnei rohe, i pōwhiritia ki a mātou ki te kōrero ki a rātou, ki te āta whakarongo, ki o rātou nawe, o rātou mamai, o rātou whiako i te huripare. Toko ono ngā kōrero ka tukuna ki te kaunihira. He mea tino pauri mo te mana whenua, ko te kaha o te huripare ki o rātou kāinga.
Me hunuku rātou?
Well, koira te pātai nune, koira te kōrero, ka kōrero hia rātou.
And just in English, for my colleague Kate Nicol-Williams, what were the main recommendations for the Hawke's Bay Regional Council in terms of addressing inequities for Māori communities?
Yeah, well, first up, one of the clear themes that came through in all of the engagement that we did was that mana whenua were disproportionately affected and impacted by this flood event. And this is particularly so because often where Māori communities are now based, places such as Tāngoio, Petane, Waiohiki, those are on the last remaining lands of what were once much larger land holdings. And so there were known flood risks in these places, but mana whenua had no other options because that was the only land remaining. So one of the things we have very much encouraged the Regional Council to do is to partner with mana whenua, to listen to their kōrero tuku iho, their knowledge of their awa. Nobody knows those awa better than mana whenua who have lived there by rāno. There are a range of other recommendations in the report.
Do you expect that those whānau will have to move?
Again, that's not really part of our responsibilities. We've listened to the communities, we've written our report and made our recommendations.
Is it fair to say that some of these risks you've identified in Hawke's Bay could be applied to many of our other regions in New Zealand where there are floodplains, there's a reliance on stop banks and there's a lack of flood alerts and trigger warnings?
We haven't focused on other regions. I think it's fair to say that anywhere where you get 500 millimetres of rain falling in short order is going to cause issues. The extent to which other regions would be affected if Cyclone Gabrielle were to occur in those places, we just simply don't know, other than to say this was clearly a major flood. And if a similar flood were to occur in other places in New Zealand, you'd expect a response needed to investigate the causes and the consequences and the way forward.
So these learnings would be relevant to other regions?
We would hope so.
One more question for mana whenua. For Waiheke, there's been a sentiment that high Māori population, they weren't as well protected, I suppose, by stop banks as on the other side of the river we have Taradale. Through the report, was there anything that substantiated that for you? Or
Well, the very strong kōrero of mana whenua, so the people who live at Waiheke and in that area, and it's an inequity that we consider the Regional Council needs to address and look to make solutions in the future with mana whenua.
And the iniquity specifically, is it that there wasn't a similar sized stop bank protecting that community? Is that the...
Probably that's a technical question for Kyle, but the perception from the kōrero we had with people was that Taradale was protected by a high stop bank, whereas Waiheke was not. So there is a perception in some communities of a different treatment.
And Kyle, just on that exact line of question, I suppose, was Taradale better protected than Waiheke?
The Taradale stop bank had been recently constructed up to a 500-year standard. The rest of the Hiratonga Plain stop bank system was at 100-year. There's been a proposal passed through council to upgrade all of the system up to a 500-year. The only part of that had been completed prior to the flood was Taradale, so it was afforded a higher degree of protection.
So essentially there was plans in the works to upgrade Waiheke side, but Taradale was done first. Is that fair?
That's from what the information I've been provided, the design standard was proposed to be increased for the whole plains. That's correct. But just yet hadn't been completed.
Right. But certainly when the flood came, sorry, last question on this, the flood bank certainly was higher on the Taradale side, for exactly how you put it.
Exactly right, yeah. So it's always going to go to the flood arrives at the weakest point, and that's where it's going to go. So it's going to go there first.
You've made your recommendations. Do you believe that council should take responsibility or apologise for some of the failings that you mentioned?
I think that's beyond our terms of reference. Our terms of reference have been to evaluate what happened and to make recommendations going forward. What the council does is the council's business. We've simply reported, we've made a series of recommendations, and really, as I said earlier, our job is now done. What the council should or should not do is really a question for council, not for us.